Okay, so this is lecture 2, and it's on measurement, psychometrics. That's psychological measurement, and there are psychometric specialists, and often those are personality psychologists, and I'm a personality psychologist as well as a clinical psychologist. And I actually got obsessed with measurement, strangely enough, about, it certainly wasn't something that I expected to have happened, by the way, about in 1993, 94, when I first went down to Boston to teach, because I started to get interested in, well, actually what happened, I might as well tell you the story. It's kind of an interesting story. So I was down at Harvard teaching, and the salaries were actually quite low, especially given relative to the cost of living in the Boston area. And you might be surprised about that, because of course it's a very rich institution, but generally speaking, when people are asked to go teach there, they don't say no. And so, well, right, so it's not like you have a lot, what are you going to do? You're going to say no? No, you're not, and they know that, and so your bargaining power is zero, and you know, and so that has a commensurate effect on salary, and it's not like they're out of line with other academic salaries, but they were on the low end, and it was very expensive there. And my wife couldn't work because we were Canadian, and she didn't have a green card, so I taught extra courses at night, I think 3 of them, to make ends meet. And this was kind of distressing to me, not that I minded doing the extra teaching, although it was somewhat tiring, but I thought, well, this is peculiar, because here I've got this job, and hypothetically what I'm supposed to do is be devoting as much time as I possibly can to research, but I can't do that because I have to do this additional teaching, because otherwise I can't afford to live. And so I phoned the dean at one point and I said something like, what the hell? How can this be? Because it seems counterproductive. It's like, what's the rationale here? I don't really understand it. And he said, well, most of our people consult. And I thought, no, that's complete rubbish. Your junior professors don't consult because they just got here. And like, if you're going to do consulting, you have to have a network. You can't just hang out your shingle and consult. It takes like 10 years to build a consulting network. And I thought, well, that's complete rubbish and not helpful for me. And I thought, well, is there anything I know that's actually of practical utility to people that I could consult on? And so then I started thinking about this project I had been involved with at McGill. And so what we had done was, so there's a part of the brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and it's at the front of the brain, and it's a more evolutionary new part of the brain, and it's expanded very rapidly in the last 7 million years since we diverged from our common ancestor, the chimpanzees. And it's the part of the brain, like the cortex in general, is often regarded as the part of the brain that makes us specifically human, that gives us our linguistic capacity, for example, our ability to see forward into the future, and the ability to regulate our behavior in a very complex manner. And the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seems to be the part of the brain that's particularly associated with abstract problem solving. Now, we were curious when I worked at McGill about the relationship between dorsolateral prefrontal cognitive function and antisocial behavior, especially in adolescence. And I worked with a research team there who was trying to understand antisocial behavior. And so one of the things we did was take a battery of neuropsychological tests that had been designed at the Montreal Neurological Institute to assess people with known forms of brain damage because of psychosurgery, and start to use them on adolescents who had cognitive or who had conduct disorder problems, on the assumption that it was perhaps specific impairments in their ability to problem solve that might be associated with their conduct disorder. And so we put together a battery of these tests, all of which were done with little machines or on paper and pencil, and it took about 9 to 10 hours for a trained neuropsychologist to administer. And I thought, okay, we're assessing dorsolateral prefrontal function. We're using it to study psychopathology, right? To study abnormal behavior from a clinical perspective, but maybe we could flip that. It could be the case that people who have enhanced dorsolateral prefrontal cognitive function would be exceptional performers academically or in the industrial organizational setting. So I thought, well, maybe we'll make a battery of neuropsychological tests and computerize it. So it was just at the point then where that became possible, because Windows had just come out and it was starting to become more possible to do such complex such complex programming, and so we designed what I think was the world's first dorsolateral prefrontal computerized battery. I designed that with a graduate student of mine named Daniel Higgins, and we worked on that for a very long period of time. And the idea was, well, maybe we could use performance on a battery of tests, so that'd be a number of tests, to predict how well people would do academically and how well they might do as managers and administrators and perhaps as entrepreneurs. And so we spent about 5 years figuring out how to predict academic and organizational behavior. And this really made me obsessive about measurement, because I actually wanted to predict something useful, right? And so I needed to know exactly what the relationship was between the performance and the outcome, and that meant I had to measure performance on the tests exactly, and I needed to know what performance meant. And then I also had to figure out how you measure performance in the workplace, because that's not an easy thing, right? Like if you're a salesperson, you can measure your performance in a fairly straightforward manner by how many dollars you bring in per year. But you also might be the kind of salesman who a company brings in who's a little on the psychopathic side, and you lie and cheat to your customers, and it just ramps up your income like mad for the first year and makes the entire company's income decline precipitously the next year. That's a time frame problem, right? Just because something works now doesn't mean it'll work tomorrow and the next day. And so even in relatively simple situations where you think you could use an index like money generated by a salesman as an index of performance, there's still obvious complex problems like, well, maybe that salesman irritates the rest of your salespeople, or, as I said, interferes with customer relationships. And so it's very hard to get a measure of performance in a complex organization that matches the effect of the organization on the real world. And that's actually, as far as I'm concerned, the fundamental reason why a free market economy actually works, is because what a free market economy, imagine that the environment is shifting around all the time, and of course it is, not least because of technological progress, but also because world events throw everything into upheaval all the time. The environment's dancing around like mad, and trying to stay on top of it with your measurement system is virtually impossible. It's a very, very difficult task. And so what you do is you distribute decision-making power to as many brains as you possibly can. That's what you do with the free market system. And you hope that their aggregated response either constitutes the environment or tracks the environment. It's something like that. And it's possible that there is no other solution. This is why centralized economies don't work, as far as I'm concerned, is that you cannot predict the direction that the environment's going to move, not with sufficient accuracy. And so you can't plan a complex system, because the assumptions that you're making while you're making your plans are going to change on you in an unexpected way. That's sort of the definition of reality itself. Reality is, what is it? Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. It's something like that. Anyway, so we encountered the measurement problem on two fronts. The first question is, well, how in the world do you assess, let's say, general competence from the measurement perspective? And I don't want to watch you for 5 years, because that's really not measurement. That's just, in some sense, that's just observation of reality. I want to compress that ability to assess into a short period of time so that it's got practical utility. And so we used these dorsolateral prefrontal tests. And then I was also interested in whether or not there were additional sources of measurement that might add what's called incremental validity. So imagine that you have a variable that predicts an outcome, and that variable accounts for a certain amount of the outcome. So you nail that down. Then what you want to do is add a different measure that adds additional prediction. And that's one way of determining whether what you've discovered is actually useful if you're a psychologist. Imagine there's a set of measures that psychologists have already established that do predict performance, behavior in some important manner, and you think you've come up with a new way of doing it. Then one of the things you have to show is that your new way of doing it adds something to the old ways of doing it, because otherwise you've just invented the same thing and given it another name. And that happens in psychology almost all the time. And so I got extremely skeptical about measurement, and have become become even more skeptical since then, partly because I worked with this student on building this computerized neuropsychological battery, and to do that we had to go way deep into the neuropsychological literature, but then we found that there was an overlap between the neuropsychological literature and the IQ literature, because problem solving and planning turns out to be something that's integrally associated with intelligence, and so there's an overlap between intelligence and neuropsychological function, and so then we had to learn what the overlap was, and it turned out that it was way larger than we had suspected or that anyone else had suspected. And anyways, there's a cognitive domain that's usefully, what would you say, assessed for predictive validity, and there's a personality domain. And this is when I started to get interested in the Big Five models that we're going to talk about in detail today, because the thing about the Big Five models, like the cognitive variables, is that they could be assessed reliably and validly, and they did have incremental predictive utility. So if you're actually trying to figure out how to account for someone's behavior, even predicting the future, they worked. And then at the same time, this was kind of cool too, at the same time, right early in the 90s, there were psychologists working on another problem, which was, let's say that you could increase the accuracy of your ability to predict how well an employee would perform by 10%, something like that. What would the economic consequence of that be? And the answer to that turned out to be huge beyond belief. And it's because, and we'll talk about this in some detail, performance among human beings is not normally distributed. A normal distribution is a distribution where most people are in the middle and there's a few people at the edges, and lots of things are normally distributed. Height is normally distributed, weight is normally distributed, intelligence is normally distributed, the personality traits are normally distributed. There's a general theorem in social sciences that what would you call phenomena of interest, measurable phenomena of interest are normally distributed. It's like an axiom, a belief, but it's not true for everything. And that actually turns out to be dead bloody relevant, because it's not true for creative achievement, it's not true for productivity, and it's not true for the distribution of material goods. Not at all true. In fact, a completely different distribution holds. And if you look at your employees, for example, what you're going to find is that a small proportion of them are responsible for almost all of the productivity. So for example, if you have 10 salesmen, 3 of them are going to make half your sales. But if you have 100 salesmen, 10 of them are going to make half your sales. And if you have 1,000, then 30 of them are going to make half your sales. And that follows a distribution called the Pareto distribution. A small number of people end up doing most of the work, and a small number of people end up accruing most of the gains, and there's some overlap between those who do most of the work and those who accrue most of the gains, but it's not perfect, right? Because of course no system is perfect. And so the reason that increasing your ability to predict the behavior of a potential person that you hire by some increment is so high is because at the upper end the gains are magnified by this Pareto distribution phenomena. You want to have, if 30 of your salespeople out of 1,000 do half the work, it'd be good to have 33 people like that, right? If you could possibly manage to select them. So anyways, we did this, we computerized this battery, and we found that, sure enough, people who did well on this dorsolateral prefrontal battery were much better academically. We showed that at the University of Toronto and at Harvard. They were better managers and administrators. We showed that in an industrial setting. And you could gain additional predictive validity using that measure by adding a measure of conscientiousness to it from the Big Five. And so we could predict long-term job performance with a fair degree of accuracy and with immense economic utility. Then we spent a whole decades trying to sell our assessment process that we developed to corporations, which was a complete bloody catastrophe. It didn't work at all. Partly because we realized that there's a whole bunch of reasons. Perhaps I'll tell you some of them, but one of them was that corporations, generally speaking, at the middle management level are much more interested in never taking a risk, never being held responsible for any decision, and never annoying anyone than they are concerned about increasing productivity and the bottom line. And I'm actually not being cynical about this, although I was for a long time. It took me I couldn't believe that corporations who are hypothetically motivated by economic maximization wouldn't be interested in a technology that would demonstrably increase their productivity. And not just a little bit, but by a huge amount with huge multiplier. But people are more wired to be sensitive to the possibility of failure and the emergence of the unexpected than they are motivated by gain, especially when the gains that their risk might produce aren't associated with their progress. You know, so for example, I talk to HR subsections within a company, and they'd say, well, we're not credited with any productivity improvements that our assessment processes produce. It's like, well, you're dead in the water then, right? Because I'm going to ask you to take a big risk on an unproven technology, and if it works, none of the benefit is going to go to you, even in terms of people understanding that you did it, and if it doesn't work, then you get fired. It's like, well, that's not a sellable proposition. Anyway, so while I was studying measurement, I was trying to figure out how it was that you made something that was a good measure. And this is, you can't believe how important this is, because there's all these concepts floating around right now that are really bending and twisting our political landscape around. You know, like microaggression, that's one, and safe spaces, and white privilege, and patriarchy, and self-esteem, that's another one. All these concepts that sound like they represent something real, that have never been subjected to the kind of analysis that would be necessary to determine whether or not they represent something real in the world. And there's a technology, and that's the psychometric technology, the measurement technology that I described, that actually helps you determine whether or not what you're measuring exists and whether or not it's real. And these are complicated questions, because it's not obvious what it means to have something exist. And it's not obvious what it means for it to be real. Now, the way we generally solve that is we don't. Because, like, let's say you and I are having a conversation, and of course you're using a bunch of individual words, like anger, let's say you wake up, you said, I woke up this morning and I had a discussion with my wife and I got angry. And see, I'm not going to say to you, well, what do you mean angry? And the reason is because I also get angry, so I know what you mean. But what I might say is, well, what were the circumstances that elicited anger in you this morning? And then you're going to tell me a story, or you might have already, that enables me to understand what exactly you mean in that context by the word anger. You know, and then maybe I'll have a conversation with you and I'll find out that you were angry this morning too, but it was for a whole different set of reasons, and maybe I have the same conversation with you, and what that means is that the word anger stands for slightly different things in all three of your situations. There's some underlying commonality, but it doesn't matter because you specify the meaning by the entire conversation, right? It's not like we just go around to each other and throw out words. Single, fear. I don't come up to you on the street and say fear unless I want you to run away. You know, so we contextualize. And so the fact that our single words don't necessarily represent real categories, like real scientific categories in the world, doesn't matter because we're always contextualizing with our conversation. But you can't get away with that in science, because in science what you're trying to do is to build a category that well, it's like a proper set. You can precisely define its parameters, like the set of all triangles, right? Triangles have to have three angles, and they have to be closed. They have to be closed forms. And so the three angles have to add up to 180 degrees. And if they don't, then it's not a triangle, right? It's like there's triangles and there's things that aren't triangles, and the border is very, very tight. But lots of things in the real world aren't like that, like psychiatric diagnostic categories, for example, aren't like that at all, even though they're kind of real in a strange sense. And so you're trying to make your concept as real as you can in the realm of psychology, and so then you have to figure out how to do that. And so there are rules. And so let's talk about, we'll make this specific. We'll talk about how the personality traits themselves were identified and discovered. And I think discovered is the right word. And the personality literature is particularly interesting because it's basically brute force empiricism. It's not theory. I mean, there's always some theory. and I'll lay out the theory, but it was as close to a-theoretical as you could really manage, I would say, once you accepted a certain set of axioms. Okay, and now you have to have axioms in your thinking. You have to make presuppositions, and the reason for that is you have to start somewhere, right? Otherwise you're in the problem of infinite complexity again. So you have to take some things for granted. You do that with mathematics, you do that with statistics, you do that with everything you do, as a matter of fact. And so there are axiomatic presuppositions that underlie the development of the Big Five model, and I'll lay out what they are. So the first one was, it's reasonable to assume that human lexicons, and so that would be the entire vocabulary structure, the linguistic structure of language and communication, have captured the essential elements of personality. And so that theory, that presumption, is based on the idea that, well, we don't have anything much more important to talk about than ourselves and other people, and the probability is that over the centuries, the thousands of years, the tens of thousands of years that our language has evolved, that we've come up with a lexicon that does a pretty good job of covering the major sources of variation and commonality among human beings. Now, you could dispute that. You could say, well, no, we're just not that smart, and there might be important elements of human behavioral variability, perceptual variability, that we've never cottoned on to and haven't captured linguistically. And, people have made that claim, but we're not going to have that discussion today. We're just going to accept this axiom. We could accept it as reasonable, and then we could say, well, let's proceed on that basis and see if anything useful emerges. And we've kind of already defined what useful might mean. Could we increase our ability to understand and to predict and to control, let's say? And so we can test that. So that's the first hypothesis, the first axiom. And the second is that there are various ways that you might get access to that lexical information. And one would be, you could ask people questions. So there's a theory there. People know enough about their own personality to report on it with some degree of accuracy. Okay, now that turns out to be true under certain conditions. If I ask you a bunch of questions about yourself, you're likely to answer in a way that's valid and reliable. Valid means it predicts something else of importance, and reliable means if I measure you twice across some time span, that the measurements are going to be highly associated with one another, so that you look like the same person across repeated tests. Because if it's not reliable, imagine you had a ruler that was like really, you could stretch it, or it would stretch by itself, and contract randomly. It's like, well, it's not much use as a ruler. It's not reliable. And a reliable measure produces the same results when you use it repeatedly. And the more reliable a measure is, generally speaking, the better. And there are statistical indices for describing the reliability of a measure, and there are certain parameters that are acceptable for reliable psychological measures. The implicit association test that everybody talks about now that measures implicit bias is not sufficiently reliable to be used as a clinical diagnostic tool. It's not even close. Okay, the most reliable measure we know of is IQ. IQ is unbelievably reliable. We give you a test now, we wait 5 years, unless something's happened to you in the interim, the probability that your scores, especially in rank order comparison to other people, have remained stable is incredibly high. So anyways, so now the next issue here is there might be a variety of different ways that language has captured the essential variation. Full questions, I could ask you full questions. I could use phrases, I could use adjectives. Now people have tried verbs and nouns, and I'm not going to go into that today, but we'll stick with that. Full questions, phrases, and adjectives. And what you'd hope is that if there is something underlying the use of these descriptors, that questions, phrases, and adjectives would all come up with the same answer, essentially. And that is what has been discovered. So there are big 5 measures that use full questions, there are big 5 measures that use phrases, there are big 5 measures that use adjectives, and you still get the full 5 dimensions. Okay, so then what do you do next if you're going to construct a measure? I ask a bunch of people, as many as I possibly can, as many questions as I possibly can. And so maybe what I would do, so for example, when we made a measure of political correctness 2 years ago. And you might say, well, what's political correctness? And the answer is, well, we don't know. That's what we're trying to figure out. So it's like, well, how do you construct a measure then? And so what we did, we got a team of graduate students together, and we asked them to lay out as many questions as they possibly could that they might ask people if they were assessing them for political correctness, whatever that was. And then we had undergraduates scour journalism accounts, news accounts, and find out what people were referring to as politically correct, and turn those into questions. And we produced way more questions than we wanted, 400 of them, which is too many, right? Because who's going to sit down and do a questionnaire that has 400 questions, and it takes too long? So then you want to shrink it down. But what you do first is you ask people way more questions about who they are than you would like to end up with. All right, so it's like you have a target and you're using a shotgun at a long distance. You know, you're going to hit a bunch of things that aren't the target, but you're also going to hit the target. And then you can use statistical techniques to zero in and find out what the canonical questions are. Now, here's the basic idea. If there's a pattern to these questions, like maybe if I asked 400 questions, I'd get 400 different answers. So then there'd be no simplification, and each answer would be unique, so you might answer question 1 and 2 one way, and you would answer question 1 and 2 a different way, right? There'd be no pattern between them, and so we might end up with 400 factors. A factor would be the manner in which questions clump together, and I'll tell you what clump together means in a minute. It might be that they don't clump together at all, and that there's an infinite number of ways of varying, like maybe people vary on 400 dimensions. But what powerful statistics will enable you to do is to see if people answer the questions in a patterned way. So let's say you answered question 1 and 20 with 9 out of 10, and you answered question 1 and 20 with 2 out of 10, and you answered questions 1 and 20 with 7 out of 10. We'd see that, and that was the case across people. There was a relationship between how everyone answered question 1 and question 20. And then you might say, well, it wasn't just question 1 and 20, it was question 1 and 20 and 40 and 69 and 85 and 125 and 113. And so then you see that there are questions that are answered in similar ways across people. And so correlational analysis can show you that, because you can correlate every question with every other question. You can see, well, if you answered question 1, if I plotted your answer to question 1 against your answer to question 2, I'd see that there was a relationship. Let's say that was across the entire set of people. But then that's a huge matrix, 400 questions by 400 questions. It'd take you forever to assess that. And so people invented this technique called factor analysis, which is like an analysis of correlations, and enables you to find patterns of correlations. Or to put it a different way, it enables you to find questions that clump together. So if I know how you answered question 1, I can be pretty sure about how you answered question 10, and so forth. And then it also tells you how many patterns there are. And so it turns out that if you ask people enough questions about themselves, using questions or phrases or adjectives, that you get 5 dimensions. And not only that, that if you do that cross-culturally, the 5-dimensional structure is pretty stable. Now, there's a couple of ways of doing that. You can take the English language set, and you can derive out the questions, and then you can split them into their 5 factors, and then you can translate them and give them to people in different cultures and see if the statistical relationships remain relatively constant. Or you can go into the other language and regenerate the entire lexical set and start from the bottom up. And regardless of which of those 2 techniques you use, the 5-factor solution appears pretty stable. Now, that doesn't mean that it's fixed and finite, because there are multiple other solutions. You can come out with a 20-factor solution, although the predictive utility of the factors decreases as the number increases, and the number of items per factor shrinks as well. And so you have to use a little bit of judgment, you know. You don't want to have too many factors because you're after simplicity. You don't want 400 factors if you had 400 items. It'd be nice to have 5. That's a lot simpler. It's a lot simpler to work with 5 things. And, well, maybe you want multiple items per factor so that you can, because your measurement's going to be more accurate if there's multiple items. And it's not just something idiosyncratic. And hopefully that'll be more replicable across situations. So you have to use your judgment a little bit. You want simplicity. You want to account for most of the variability, but you want simplicity because otherwise it's not useful as a tool. A tool is supposed to make the job simpler, not more difficult. So anyways, the upshot of this, although there's some debate around the edges, is that there's a stable 5-factor solution. Okay, and the 5 factors are extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness. And we've developed a 10-aspect variant of that breaks each of the 2 traits into each of the 5 traits into 2 aspects. So that gives us a 10-aspect solution, which is higher resolution, right? More complex. That's the downside, because now you have to use 10 variables instead of 5, and you want simplicity. But one thing you would try to test out as a reasonable social scientist is whether the additional complexity buys you sufficient ability to understand and predict to make the additional complexity worthwhile. And the Big 5 aspect scale, which is really the measure that we'll concentrate on today, I think does a nice job of hitting the sweet spot between complexity and accuracy. Now, there are times when the 5-factor solution is even better, and there's a 2-factor super solution, which is we've also derived. So extroversion and openness clump together, and so does neuroticism reversed. That's often called emotional stability, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. So it's sometimes possible to use the 2-factor solution as a predictor for behavior, or sometimes the 5-factor solution, and sometimes the 10-aspect solution. Think about it as a differentiated hierarchy. 2 factors at the top, that's as simple as it can be, but you lose resolution. 5, well, it's a bit more complex, it's higher resolution, but it's still pretty simple, so you lose that if it was possible. And then 10, well, if it's really important to you to accrue additional differentiation when you're analyzing certain phenomena, then you might want to use the 10-factor solution, 10-aspect solution, especially if you can measure it in the same amount of time. And it turns out that you can. You can get a pretty stable 5-factor estimate with 100 questions, but you can get a pretty stable 10-aspect solution with 100 questions as well. Because then that's another consideration, practical consideration, right? You can't have, if it's going to be usable in any practical sense, which is different than it being objectively true, right? It's a pragmatic issue, then it has to be something that doesn't irritate people to death, and to be usable in the lab, but also hypothetically to the degree that that would be possible in the real world. And so, okay, so that's basically how this was derived. Now, once you derive a measure, then you have the problem of what does it predict? We already described that. But you also have the problem, and it's an associated problem of, well, what other measures is it associated with it, or might it replace? Because there's dozens of measures in psychology. And this is a weird thing, because if you think about it, a lot of psychological measurements rely on people's self-report. They're questionnaires. Okay, now, the Big 5 people came along, roughly, this really got going in the 1990s, and said, hey, look, if you take a broad enough selection of questions and you subject it to factor analysis, you get 5 clumps of questions. And so here's their conclusion. This is the weak conclusion. The weak conclusion is that if you take a language-based approach to the assessment of human similarities and differences in personality, the underlying structure has 5 dimensions. That's the weak conclusion. Okay. The strong conclusion is that personality has 5 dimensions. But we don't have to go with the strong conclusion. We can go with the weak conclusion. We can say, well, insofar as you could measure it with language, personality has 5 dimensions. And then that begs a very important question. Well, if you have other measures that you derived as a consequence of self-report with language, and they have different names, But the rule is that if you do the analysis properly, you only get 5 factors, and we already named them. Then how do you know that those additional measures aren't just variations of that big 5-factor structure? And the answer generally is, well, we don't want to know. Because I've been studying my construct, let's call it inhibition among children, for like 20 years, and now I'm going to find out, well, it's a variant of introversion, or it's a variant of neuroticism. It's like, I don't want to know that. And so one of the things that is really challenging in a field like psychology is to get the damn variables reduced to the minimal number, because people don't want to give up their measure. And the reason they don't want to give up their measure is because they've staked their career on it. And these aren't trivial problems. This is not a trivial problem. They've staked their career on it, and their career, their moral justification for their position in the career hierarchy is predicated on the validity of their measure. They give up the idea that their measure is valid, then they give up their claim to that position. And that no one wants to do that, but you don't want to be revealed as, you know, fundamentally blind and incompetent, especially when you're in a position of relative authority and benefit. And so people have real reason to resist this sort of thing. And you know, you don't want to be too cynical about that. You want to put yourself in the position of someone who's found out that what they studied for the last 20 years doesn't exist. And I'm not well liked among many psychologists for exactly that reason, because I think that almost everything that psychologists measure don't exist. Self-esteem, for example, is a great example of that. And, you know, because we're always trying to raise people's self-esteem, but you can predict self-esteem almost perfectly by taking extroversion and subtracting neuroticism from it. And so people with high self-esteem have more positive emotion and less negative emotion. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And I'm dead serious about it. I'm dead serious about that. And that's a big problem, given that there are literally tens of thousands of studies on self-esteem, whole educational institutions devoted to, you know, enhancing self-esteem. It's like, yeah, that's a problem because it doesn't exist. Not in the fundamental sense. You've got it conceptualized wrong. It isn't even about how you view yourself. It's about the relative balance between positive and negative emotion, and a huge chunk of that is actually biologically determined and part of your essential temperament. Plus, it's not obvious that more of it is better than less. Because, well, maybe you're worried and anxious. It's like, well, that's, you know, rough on you and maybe kind of hard on the people around you, but maybe it makes you more sensitive to threat in your environment, and that's exactly appropriate. Because maybe the people in your environment who are less threat sensitive are more likely to end up dead. And it's not like being anxious is pleasant, and it's going to be reflected in heightened self-consciousness and more self-denigration, because if you're high in negative emotion, you have more self-doubt. But that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It just means that it's not pleasant. And, you know, people also might feel bad for you because you're sweating and worried and anxious and nervous and all of that. You don't think much of yourself and all of that, but that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means that, well, in the best of all possible hypothetical worlds, you know, it could be otherwise. So the big 5 and IQ, which we'll also talk about a fair bit today, they are concept killers. And, you know, one of the things that's been happening in psychiatric literature, for example, there's all this plethora of psychiatric diagnosis, especially on the personality disorder end of the distribution. And the big 5 theorists have been insisting, no, you've got to reconceptualize your entire diagnostic scheme, because these forms of psychopathology are actually extreme variants of the underlying big 5 structure. And that war has been going on for 30 years. It's very, and you know, that's not that long, historically speaking. There has been a shift towards big 5 conceptualizations, but you know, it's long in the span of a single lifetime, and it looks like it's proceeding at a glacial pace. And so, okay, so now you've got your measures, and you want to find out, well, are they good for anything? And so the first thing you might want to do is you want to correlate them with a bunch of other measures. And you find out, for example, that measures of anxiety and depression, they correlate very highly with measures of neuroticism. They're all clumping together into a negative emotion dimension. Impulsivity, inattentivity, those things, and sociability, those things tend to clump with extroversion. The proclivity to be interested in people and to want to take care of people, That's an empathy dimension. That tends to clump with agreeableness. The proclivity to be competitive and predatory, but you can be predatory in a socialized manner, by the way, which we'll talk about when we get to agreeableness. That sort of clumps with disagreeableness. The proclivity to be orderly, that goes along with conscientiousness. So does the proclivity to be industrious. Creativity stacks up with openness, and so does intelligence. And so you can use the big five as like a periodic table of the elements and start to say, and IQ, because you've got to put IQ in there too. You can use that as the basic foundation. Say, look, we've discovered the underlying pattern. And now we can start slotting all these other measures into a conceptual scheme, and that's still sorting itself out in psychology, partly because it's difficult to do, but also partly because people want to cling to their constructs, and so they won't test them against other predictors. So in my lab, for example, there was a rule. If you came up with a new conception, one of the things we wanted to do, for example, we're interested in predicting academic performance, and we thought maybe if you measured people's values, you'd get some incremental predictive validity. We already knew that IQ you could measure, and that would predict quite highly academic performance. And conscientiousness, that was also a pretty good predictor. Not as good as IQ, but pretty good. And so the combination of those two would pick up about 25% of the variance in academic performance. It doesn't sound like a lot because it leaves 75% unaddressed, but you know, we don't measure academic performance that accurately. It's actually pretty hard. Like grade point average isn't a necessarily dead accurate measure of your academic proclivity. People take different number of courses, right? So that complicates it. People drop courses if they're not doing well, and they do that at a differential rate. People take courses of different difficulty, and universities are different in their level of difficulty. And so there's all this error in academic measurement, and so you can't predict an error-ridden measurement very well. So 25% of the variance might be picking up almost all of the signal. Who knows? I think it probably is, by the way. And anyways, we tried to add values to the mix, and we used this character whose name, Schwartz, had spent a lifetime working on a value structure that was also questionnaire based, which begged the question, was it just a big five variant? But in any case, we gave students a value survey as well, and then used IQ, and then used conscientiousness first, because we knew they worked and that they were fundamental predictors, and then added values in. And the first study we did, we found that there were two values. I'm not going to tell you what they were, that did predict academic performance. It was an exploratory analysis, and so we tended to capitalize on chance. And so I wouldn't let my student publish it before he replicated it. When we replicated it twice, and it failed both times. We couldn't find any evidence for additional predictive utility. And then he didn't get his PhD. So that's the cost, right? You know, that's partly why this is so difficult, is if you're going to be skeptical about your own measure, what you want to do is you want to set your damn experiment up so it has a high probability of failing. So if you're going to measure, like I want to predict academic performance, I've got this new measure, let's say it's grit. You've heard about grit, most of you. Grit is nothing but conscientiousness. I am absolutely dead serious about that. All that happened was that people who didn't know the literature invented a new concept and then failed to do their measurement properly. And so they produced this huge uproar in the popular literature and in the school systems about grit and its miraculous, what would you say, its miraculous properties. And it's because they didn't do the fundamental analysis properly. But the person who invented it ended up with a, what were those called, those genius scholarships? MacArthur Genius Fellowship, for her work on grit. And so, even though it was like someone rediscovered iron and gave it another name, it's like, oh look, isn't this stuff hard? It's like, yeah, we already knew that. So, but it's a huge problem. And so, so what you try to do is you try to stack the experiment against yourself. But the cost of that is, well, my student, for example, he spent like 3 years doing these studies, and there were other reasons he didn't get his PhD, but like, that's rough, man. 3 years of, you know, you do your statistical analysis, it's like pulling the arm on a one-armed bandit. You know, it's 2 years of what's worse, 2 years of work, click, bang, there are the results. It's like, you're not very smart. That's the results, you know. And he was plenty smart and quite hardworking, but the cost of failure in science is so high that scientists are very motivated not to fail, and that means that we've set up the system wrong, right? Because they have to be allowed to fail. Okay, so anyways, those are the 5 factors. I should also point out, because we'll also talk a little bit about child development, is they're also importantly associated. This is another area of convergent validity. What you want to find is that your measures measure something that other measures don't, right? Because otherwise, what good are they? You want to show that your measures predict something that other measures can't, even if you aggregate them. And you want to show that your measure predicts the same thing that other measures that are like your measure predict. So that's convergent, same as other measures, divergent, different than other measures, and construct. So construct, that's wrong. Criterion. Criterion is the target, the thing that you're trying to predict. And so you want to see, is your measure stable across repeated administrations? That's reliability. Is it valid? Does it predict something of importance? Is it associated with other similar measures? Is it different in important ways from what already exists? And then is it useful for multiple different criteria? And then you have something that's, well, then hypothetically you have something that exists because you can detect it. But even more importantly, and this is where the line between objective and pragmatic truth shades in science, because you don't just want an objective truth in science. It's objectively true that this floor is, uneven, but who cares? Because what are you going to use that fact for? It's not an interesting fact scientifically, and the reason for that is it doesn't have any functional purpose. And so a lot of what we're trying to do in science is to find things that you can actually detect and measure, but that also have a useful purpose, right? So even though we claim that science is essentially an objective process of determining objective truth, it's more complicated than that, because you only are motivated to identify objective truths that are of pragmatic utility. Now, there's one level of complexity above that, which is, well, sometimes you don't know if what you've discovered has pragmatic utility, and it might. And so then you could add to the motivation for scientific discovery the discovery of new objective realities that might have functional utility. Electricity fell into that camp. I think when the person who identified electromagnetic radiation, the name escapes me, he was being grilled in the British House of Commons, or in the House of Lords, Faraday, about the utility of his discovery, and he famously said, well, of what use is a newborn baby? And so, which turned out to be quite intelligent with regards to electromagnetic radiation, because it turned out to be quite spectacularly useful. So, but, okay, so when people study child behavior, children are kind of lower resolution than adults. Their personalities aren't quite as differentiated, but you still see the glimmerings of the big 5 structure. You see differences in children in terms of positive emotion, activity level, and sociability, so that'd be extroversion. You see differences in children that are stable within the child in terms of their anxiety and difficulty in soothability and frustration, tolerance, that sort of thing. Probability of crying, and so that's negative emotion, that's neuroticism. And you see differences in their ability to abide by rule-governed structures, and they call that constraint in the child. That's one of the terms anyways. And constraint seems to differentiate into agreeableness and conscientiousness as the children develop. My suspicions are you also see individual differences in creativity. We certainly know that you see them in IQ in children, so the openness to experience dimension is also, what would you say? There's variability that's evident in children at a very young age along that dimension as well. So, and that was a separate literature, so that's kind of cool, right? Because the developmental psychologist went and assessed childhood temperament independently, more or less, of the adults assessing temperament in adults, and yet they came to the same conclusion. That's another thing you want to see, is across multiple instruments of measure that the same results emerge, just like you use your eyes and your ears and your sense of touch to triangulate on the real world, right? Well, there's a wall, I can touch it, I can hear my hand against it. It's not a holographic projection. I have 3 sources of evidence that it's there. the sources of evidence are quite divergent in their structure, and so I can assume with reasonable reliability that the wall exists. We actually use 5 senses to do it, so we're quite cautious, and then we talk to each other about what's real too. Okay, so that's what you need to know about measurement theory, and so we'll stop the second lecture at this point, and then what we'll do from here on in is to talk about each of the 5 traits and their 2 aspects. So now we'll stop there for now.